First of all, welcome everybody. We're going to talk about what is the cost of poor quality, CAPA for CBD and hemp. And we will start off with a nice introduction for our guest today, Kathleen May from Triskele. Kathleen, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing awesome. A little bit about how we met. So I was at a hemp trade show in Minneapolis in January, I think it was, sometime in the winter. And I was giving a presentation on the importance of seed to sale track and traceability, and my time got moved. And there may have been around 10 people in the room, and I'm probably exaggerating it a little bit. But Kathleen was front and center. We had the chance to talk afterwards, and it didn't take me long to realize really what a rock star she is and just how strong her background is in GMP implementation. And she's literally writing the standards for CAPA, for ASTM. And I said, man, I got to get this woman on a webinar just to share your knowledge with the industry. So it's great to have you. Tell us a little bit about how and why you started your company, Triskele.
Okay, so hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So my background is pharmaceutical and medical device, pretty much working in every aspect of the quality system. And about 4 years ago, decided to start my own business, started consulting actually it was probably 5 years ago, started consulting in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, and then came across an article in American Pharmaceutical Review on microbiological testing in medical cannabis, which sparked my interest to start digging into kind of where that industry was at, and quickly learned that the industry was lacking severely on the laboratory testing side of things and just quality overall. And it was around that time in my career that I was looking to do something different. So that kind of catapulted me into the cannabis space. So I've been doing cannabis now, pretty much what I was doing in pharmaceuticals and med device in the cannabis space now for about 4 years. Still working with labs, but most of my focus lately has been working with facilities and operations, getting them ready for GMP certification.
Awesome. Well, we're honored to have you today, and there's a lot to cover. So what are we going to cover today? Well, it's a lot of focus on CAPA, Corrective Action, Preventive Action. Kind of what is it? How does it impact your quality? How does it impact your business and risk? And maybe some ways that we can simplify that a little bit with technology. Before we are able to get a little bit inside Kathleen's brain and have her share her knowledge, let's run a quick poll for us, everybody. So I'm going to post a poll because I like to keep you guys on your toes. And the poll is, how familiar are you with CAPA and the policies and procedures, just to get a sense of where everybody is at today. And I will be open and honest. My background is in starting early stage, working with early stage companies. I'm more of an entrepreneur, software services, biz dev guy. 6 months ago, I didn't know what CAPA is. So this is a great way for me to learn a little bit about it. All right, cool. Getting the results in. Let's give those results. Cool. Awesome. So we've got 4% of the people are pretty much an expert. A lot of people understand it and not quite there. A lot of people are familiar, and 19% pretty much just like me. It's relatively brand new. So let's keep rocking and rolling here. And all right, very simple question, Kathleen. Start us off with the basics. I know CAPA isn't a fraternity, but can you tell us what is it?
Sure. So CAPA, by the acronym, is Corrective Action, Preventive Action, and in a nutshell, it's just the identification of issues, investigating root cause of those issues, implementing appropriate actions, whether they be corrective or preventive, to correct those issues and to prevent recurrence or occurrence of issues. CAPA is divided into the CAPA process as well as the CAPA subsystem, and we'll get into a little bit more detail as this presentation goes on. But the CAPA process is really the documentation of the issue, your root cause analysis, and the documentation of any actions to prevent recurrence or occurrence of issues. CAPA process can be your laboratory out of specification procedures, your internal auditing procedure, your complaint procedure and process, and recall procedure, and of course non-conforming product procedures. So this slide here kind of gives a pictorial of the large C is your CAPA subsystem, which the CAPA subsystem is really the analysis of all that data from those individual CAPA processes to determine if you have a recurring issue, a systemic issue, or if maybe your issue is impacting consumer health and safety.
Yep. If I were to drill it down, it sounds like CAPA subsystems like the strategy and the process or the tactics, if that's a fair analogy.
Yeah, it's like the hub of where all your data goes, and then you can analyze that data to determine how severe your issue is.
Excellent. And so, we had a chance to talk a little bit earlier this week, and you shared a little bit about, what an auditor looks at when they review a company's CAPA process, and an experience you went through with FDA, which tied in neatly and kind of embodied the whole purpose of CAPA. Share a little bit about that story and really how that ties into, why companies want to implement CAPA.
Sure. So the last bullet on the slide, I'll focus on that, which will pretty much sum up the rest of the information on this slide. So when an auditor comes in, FDA auditor or some other regulatory body comes in to review your quality management system, the first thing they typically ask for is a list of your open CAPAs. And the reason they do that is because your CAPA program really gives them a gauge of the health of your quality management system, meaning, when you have issues, how efficient are you at resolving those issues and preventing recurrence of those issues? Auditors aren't necessarily expecting you not to have problems because nobody runs, efficiently 100% of the time, but it's really how you address those issues. So an experience that I've had, and I've had many opportunities to sit across the table from FDA inspectors, but I was working for a company. I was hired as a CAPA writer, and I'd say about 6 months into my job, I was asked to take on the role of the microbiology manager because they were having a ton of issues with sterility failures, and anybody who works in aseptic processing understands what a media fill failure is. And they got nailed in an FDA audit the year before because they just were not fixing the problem. So 30 days into my new role, the FDA came in, I'm sitting across the table, and he's reviewing, investigations from the previous year and not happy because we really didn't fix anything. So he left, and I kid you not, like within weeks of him being gone, we had another 5 sterility failures and 3 media fill failures. So it was a mad scramble, to really update the CAPA program that we had in place. And he was due to come back 3 months later. And here I am again sitting in the room with him. He's reviewing now my investigations that, for the issues. And he looked at me and he said, I have to say, this is like a complete 360 from what I saw the last time I was here. Because the investigations told a story, and he could really understand like what the root cause was, what we were doing to correct it. And we still ended up with observations, but they were nowhere near what we would have got if the CAPA program wasn't in the state that or if it was in the state that it was when he came the last time. So I can't stress enough how important it is. Auditors do look at that, and that's like the first place they go to see how your organization is functioning.
I appreciate sharing that. And so, of course, in this, there's a process, right? And I think you've defined kind of what are the 6 basic CAPA process steps. Talk a little bit about those steps and just what some problems can be if we don't get those right.
Sure. So the very first thing you need to do is to define the issue, and that's done through what's called a problem statement or a problem description. And that problem description should really cover the who, what, when, where, and to what extent of the issue it is. That first step is very critical to scope out the investigation, because what can happen is there's this thing called scope creep. So if you don't, put those boundaries around what you're actually investigating, pretty soon you're going to be investigating things that are completely unrelated to the initial event. So that's the first step. The second is doing an initial risk assessment of the issue. There is a risk management component of the quality management system, but within CAPA itself, you need to do an initial risk assessment to determine, how critical is the issue and how deep do you really need to dig into the investigation and to determine root cause. And later on in the investigation process, you probably will do a risk assessment again because you learn new things as you start investigating, but that initial risk assessment is critical. The third, which is like the beef and the meat of the whole process, is investigating root cause and using root cause analysis tools to figure out, what happened. 4 and 5 kind of go together. I probably should have put 5 in front of 4, but once you determine what corrective actions you're going to implement, you need to verify and validate that once you implement those corrective actions, that there's no negative impact to some other process in your facility. And then the last thing is to monitor effectiveness of those corrective actions. So again, you need to make sure that what you implemented is actually working. And that effectiveness plan or that effectiveness check is based on some sort of statistical analysis, whether it be, the number of occurrences that occur over a period of time. But you need to monitor that data. And then once that data comes back, acceptable, then you can officially close the CAPA and move on.
It's dawned on me, and I'm not sure why my little brain didn't pick it up before, but I think it's instinctive for somebody in an organization to say, ooh, there's a problem, I'm just going to fix it, and not like document it or write it down. But it really seems like transparency and saying, yes, we have it, let's document this, let's identify it and share it and get it fixed is really important in this whole process. So would you agree that transparency in the organization is really an important part of CAPA as well?
Absolutely, and we'll get into this a little bit further along with, documentation. And that's actually, you hit on one of the things that it's very instinctive, I guess, and to people that don't really understand CAPA is they think they know what the issue is and they think they know what the problem is, and they just skim the surface and just address the symptoms of the issue without really getting down to the root cause. Right. And that's when you start seeing recurrence of issues and where auditors have a field day, because when you have a recurrence of a problem, it's clear that you didn't do proper root cause analysis to figure out what the issue was and you didn't implement appropriate corrective actions. So it's really important to not get, caught up with thinking you know what the issue is. Really take the time and map out all the potential, contributing factors, and then with objective evidence, rule out what, doesn't make sense and, and hone in on those things that could potentially be causing the problem.
Perfect segue into the, what are the types of actions that people should take when they see a problem?
Yeah, so in any CAPA investigation, you're going to take one or maybe all of these actions. So a correction is an immediate action to eliminate the issue, and there's typically one-time fixes. So an example of this would, be if you had an out-of-spec in your lab for final release testing. While that product should still be in the control of your facility because you're still doing final product testing, you would put that product on hold until you complete your investigation to determine the extent of the problem. A corrective action is an action to eliminate the cause of a detected issue or undesirable conditions, and a corrective action is to prevent recurrence of that particular situation. And then a preventive action is an action taken to prevent the cause of a potential problem. So it's something that hasn't happened yet, but you're going to implement actions, to prevent that occurrence. And I just want to make it clear that even though the acronym is CAPA or corrective action and preventive action, with every CAPA investigation, you don't have to initiate both. Most CAPA investigations will be a corrective action CAPA, but an example of where you might want to implement a preventive action is, say you have 2 manufacturing lines that are running the same product, and you have an issue on one, and that same issue could potentially happen on the other. So in that case, then you would implement a preventive action for that, that second manufacturing line. But you don't always have to do both, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to do both.
Got it. So there's different classifications, right? There's things that can be not a big deal, and some things that can be absolutely disastrous. Walk us through those different types of classifications, and if you can think of a story or an example that can relate, we'd love to hear it.
Sure. So CAPA our CAPAs are classified as minor, major, critical. Some operations might use low, medium, high. Same thing. So a minor CAPA would be something that typically doesn't affect product quality. You may not have to do a root cause investigation, and most likely will be corrected with a simple implementation of a correction. So an example of this would be like a documentation error on a batch record or something like that, where you would resolve that issue through your good documentation, practice, procedure, get it approved, move on. A major CAPA, it may impact product quality. There's a possibility it could impact the consumer, especially if, products out in the market and you identify an issue on, a current batch of product, you may find that you might have to recall products. It could result from, recurring minor issues, and that's where trending your data and evaluating your data is so important. Again, we'll get into that in a few slides. And most times root cause investigation is required with a major CAPA. Example of this, like I kind of said, was like an out of specification in your lab, because that's going to prevent you from releasing product. Critical investigations, those are ones in which you're going to see, potential product recalls, products out in the market. You have adulterated product that you're dealing with. So critical investigations are pretty extensive. Sterility failure investigations are a biggie if you're, again, coming from the aseptic processing world. Definitely need to have a root cause investigation, and you will be implementing some sort of corrective action and probably preventive action in those cases.
Got it. And so with all this, it really comes down to risk analysis. We talked about the 6 steps of the CAPA process, and one of the steps was identifying the levels of risk, right? So what kind of mistakes do companies make when it comes to analyzing risk, as it comes to their CAPA process?
Well, and like I said previously, you need to do that initial risk assessment just to determine, is it more of a systemic issue? Oftentimes people make the assumption it might be a one-off, and then they kind of miss the boat. They miss that, there's products in the field that potentially could be impacted. So that initial risk assessment, of course, is based on the frequency of occurrence and severity of the issue. Always have to look at, consumer health and safety. That should be everyone's, most important thing that they're looking at, especially if they're making products for consumption. So again, there's a whole other bucket of risk management, but within the CAPA umbrella, it's just really understanding the impact of the situation, and then figuring out, what's an appropriate path to take with the investigation. If it's something deeper, then you have to dig deeper. If it's something, on a minor level, then that risk is very, minimal. But risk is very important in the CAPA world.
Excellent, thank you. So a lot of the previous topics were more related to the process. Talk a little bit more about the subsystem, why it's important for organizations to embrace, and maybe a story that outlines how these systems are just so intertwined.
Sure. So, I come from the pharmaceutical and med device industries where there's, it's a one-stop shop. You're manufacturing product, you're testing product, you're releasing product. So you have all these moving parts that work together. You have supplier quality, you have regulatory. And within those departments or areas, they will have a process to address issues that happen within their own individual department. Well, you need a hub, like I said earlier, to analyze all that data to determine, is there a systemic issue across the organization, or if organizations have multiple facilities, is it possible that they could be having the same problem at one of their other facilities? So an example of kind of how this CAPA subsystem works is I was working for a company in which we started having impurity failures on one of our products. Never had an issue with this product before. And typically in that situation, the first question is, what's changed? Something's changed in the process. So the investigation, of course, brought us back to questioning our supplier, because the component that we received from them was like a plastic container, and it already had a label on it. So we were just filling that container. So we asked them, what did you change anything on your end? We have, we had a supplier agreement with them. And part of that was if they made any changes, they needed to let us know. They kept denying that they changed anything. Well, after about 2 months, they finally said to us, "Oh, you know what? We changed our vendor for our varnish on our label." And it's like, okay, we've been asking you for months, like, what did you change? So sure enough, we did some additional investigation work, did some additional testing, and found out that that was the root cause.
Wow.
So with that, that process, that investigation, impacted our quality management, or our quality, our supplier quality program. We had to issue a SCAR, or supplier corrective action report, against that supplier because they clearly were in violation of our agreement. And we were accepting their product based on C of A. Everything looked fine.
Right.
And so we had to beef that process up a little bit. We had to change our impurity method. So we had to do some additional validation on the testing side of it. And of course, your change management, your document management system is impacted by that too, because now you need to update SOPs and validations. And so that's just an example of how, all that data within the CAPA umbrella intertwine and how it can impact so many different areas of your organization.
Oh, it's overwhelming to think about. The more I learn, this a little bit scarier it is, whether it's, like you said, packaging. From here, you're talking about a label, or if how biomass, the tools that you're using, are they properly cleaned? And and oftentimes I think a lot of companies, they're using a contract manufacturer, so it's like, well, as long as they tell me everything's okay, so therefore everything's okay. And that there's just a lot of areas that things can go wrong, which is why having these systems are so important. And one of the key components of that is capturing the right data sources. Talk about data and how this fits into CAPA.
Yeah, and just one more thing on that, and it's specifically to the cannabis space, because I've worked with a number of clients that, they tell me, well, we can't get information from our suppliers, which is true, especially because, a lot of people are still buying stuff off of Amazon and using that in their operation. You're not going to get any support there or any, help if something were to go wrong. So again, it's not only establishing your supplier quality program, but it's also, your approval process for your suppliers and your vendors is critical too, because you want to make sure you're getting your raw materials and components from a reputable source in the event that you have an issue. So that was just kind of a side note, sorry.
Sure.
So this slide is just kind of another example of, those data sources or those, CAPA processes that feed into that subsystem, and they can be internal and external. External audits and the information that you gather from that is valuable data into your CAPA subsystem to maybe even make preventive action, to take preventive action measures in certain circumstances.
Excellent. No, so this next slide was interesting, and this is something that I get passionate about on a couple different levels. One, I'm somebody who's big on, the interconnectedness of our mind, body, spirit, equally as much as a person who likes to study businesses and what makes them work or not work, how different components of a business work together. If your sales team isn't closing deals, you're not going to have a company. If your product team is not developing a good quality product, people won't buy it anymore. And if your accounting team can't collect or pay your vendors on time, you're not going to last a whole lot longer. So when you presented this, it was intriguing to me. Talk a little bit about how CAPA impacts the whole organization and how leaders in that department need to think about building their team with diverse skill sets to set their company up for success.
Yeah, this slide goes perfectly in line with the example that I gave with the varnish issue. Is, we had an out of spec in our lab, and that brought us down this path of, investigating a million different things, but brought us to our supplier. And on the outcome of that, like I explained, we had to make changes to our supplier process, our testing process, when you create a team to investigate issues, your CAPA team really should be cross-functional, because there's 9 times out of 10, some other department is going to be impacted by that issue in some way, shape, or form. So it's critical to have a cross-functional CAPA team when you're investigating these issues, especially if they're, more of a critical issue and impact product. So yeah, like I said, this slide is actually a really good representation of the example that I gave and the interrelationship between those different quality systems or those CAPA processes.
Great. And so something that I think is important for any company is, man, if you can stay ahead of a problem before it occurs is ideal. And one way to do that is by capturing data and identifying trends. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and also share the story of the cannabis company that you're aware of that could have avoided a major issue by identifying a trend ahead of time.
Yeah, trending, I cannot stress enough how important it is I love data. I'm a scientist, I'm data driven. So, and I work in CAPA, which that's also, you're looking at a lot of data, but trending is very scarce, at least with the clients that I've dealt with. So, trending detects when you have a shift, which potentially could indicate that you have a loss of control somewhere in your process. And when you see a significant shift in that data, you need to react to that, because if something bad hasn't happened right now, more than likely it's going to happen. That shift in that data is your alarm that something bad may be happening. And that trending can be statistical using, pie charts, Pareto charts, and spreadsheets. But it could also be non-statistical. Like I was explaining earlier, this kind of cross-functionality, organizations, pharmaceutical organizations, they have material review boards where you have management from different areas come together and they start talking about their problems in their area. That's a way of trending data to see if maybe there is an issue across various departments. And trending really needs to be done frequently, and it depends on what it is. Most operations in the cannabis space are looking at temperature and humidity in their cultivation areas and in their processing areas, but you may have an environmental monitoring program where you're looking at, your bioburden data, and if there's a shift in that, you need to look at that, because you could potentially have product contamination. So a quick example of where I, again, can't stress enough the importance of this. I had a client who was monitoring temperature and humidity in their extraction room, and of course I asked, where did these specifications come from? Didn't really get a solid answer. And they had noticed that the data was shifting upward, especially the temperature. But they didn't react, and they didn't have a process in place to react. They didn't have, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And they came in one day and the room was it was well over 100 degrees. So they couldn't process in there. And they were down for a good week, because what they found out was that they had a failure in their HVAC unit. So it's a double whammy there. They didn't have a process in place, to trend and monitor data. They were looking at it and they were documenting it, but they knew it was going up, but they didn't react to it. And B, they didn't have a preventative maintenance program on their HVAC system. So they lost days of manufacturing and obviously revenue, simply because they didn't have a process in place to evaluate their data.
Interesting. Yes, the old "a stitch in time saves 9" theory. All those annoying little sayings our parents used to give us when we were kids, they do make sense, don't they? So on that, that's one of the key reasons our founders and our tech team integrated, analytics and, capturing data into Tag One, our system. Certain things to identify, document analytics, whether, what are upcoming expiration dates, or, what's the volume of C of A's being received or shared, or different certifications. Tracking inventory volumes and expiration dates and transaction dates, and quality assurance approvals or rejections over time, and shipping, receiving, all that we felt like was extremely important to stay ahead, identify trends and see things are going upward or downward, just to keep people ahead of the curve along the way. I'd love to kind of maybe get some thoughts on you on how important you think, technology is and should be when companies need to analyze their data.
Yeah, anytime that you can, make something electronic or data electronic, and ensuring that data, is reliable and validated, just makes your operation run so much more smooth and makes evaluating trends, that much easier, and identifying issues that much easier. Obviously, you need to have a resource, dedicated to looking at the data. But in the CAPA world, again, it is so much data driven, and manufacturers don't want to be down. They don't want downtime due to like silly, issues that could have been prevented if somebody was just looking at the data. And from a documentation perspective, from, the write-up of the investigation, again, when auditors come in, you don't want to hand them, like a binder of paper necessarily. They want to, it's a lot easier for them to look at something electronically or at least summarized and that you can print out for them than looking through pages and pages of paper.
Absolutely. And of course, hopefully it's a little faster, right? So speaking of speed and fast, talk a little about timeliness. When there's an issue, you were telling some crazy stories, just how people were not creating some certain level of urgency or how to identify, how to get things resolved, and how important that is as well.
So I included CAPA Timeliness in this presentation. Again, I've been doing what I'm doing for a really long time. This is another hot button with regulators is, when they ask for that list of open CAPAs, they're looking at what is your oldest CAPA open, and they're looking to see what that issue is all about. So if you have a CAPA that's been open for a critical issue, let's say a sterility failure, product sterility failure, and you haven't resolved that issue, but yet you're still making products and distributing products, they're going to have a problem with that. So again, it depends on the risk level of the issue, but if it's a critical issue and you're not resolving that issue and implementing appropriate corrective actions, you can bet that an auditor is going to have issue with that. So it's a fine balance of investigating quickly, but also investigating thoroughly. So it's finding that balance between the two, because you certainly don't want to rush an investigation and implement corrective actions, or, not hit the root cause, but it's finding that balance based on the criticality of the issue.
Awesome. So there's the old adage of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? And I think that probably it would relate certainly to documentation. Share a little bit about how just critical documentation is in this whole process.
Yeah, if anyone comes from the pharmaceutical space on this call, I'm sure they've heard, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Everything you do needs to be documented, again, from an auditing perspective. Primarily, they're looking for, it's objective evidence. They're looking for the objective evidence for what decisions you're making as an organization. And CAPA is no different. So any decision made along the way with CAPA, what approval and agreement on what your scope is, corrective actions you're going to implement should be documented. We didn't really get into it in this presentation because it would take quite a bit of time, but the CAPA process and the investigation process, there's phases. There's the define phase, the investigation phase, corrective action phase, and then effectiveness phase. And each phase should have a plan, like how are you going to approach, the activities within that plan. Well, those plans need to be documented and approved, and part of those plans is hitting or setting target dates for completion. And if those target dates aren't going to be, hit, then justification needs to be provided for why that isn't going to happen, and all of that needs to be documented. The other piece with documentation with CAPA, and I mentioned this a little bit previously, is that your CAPA documentation needs to tell a story. And when it doesn't tell a story, like the example I gave, when I was sitting across the table from the auditor and he was reviewing investigations from a year ago and he was like, what is this? It's so important because they don't have time. They don't have time to, it needs to be clear to them from the get-go. It needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they need to understand what happened, and they need to understand quickly. So documentation is so critical in the CAPA process.
And that's something that our team recognized, is that, A, it's really important, and B, it can be a little bit overwhelming with just the amount of documentation, the printing, sharing, collecting from buyers, collecting from suppliers, sharing with buyers, organizing it, connecting it with certain lot numbers, or if there's certifications with suppliers, and having that in one centralized system was just, we felt like, critical. And so we developed an important component of Tag 1 is that document organization. And recently we developed something that we think is pretty cool, is something we call our electronic C of A, or electronic certificate of analysis, where companies can put in the information and data from their C of A, which over time can start to analyze it, but just make it easy to create those C of As and share it. But, and of course, be able to track those analytics over time, and of course have expiration dates, which is a big issue people have with expiration date management. If you're just putting it in a Dropbox, you don't know if it existed, but if you put in the date and there's a little reminder in your reminder counter say, hey, this document expires in 30 days or 60 days, can help avoid some big mistakes. But talk a little about how helpful you think it is to have everything digitized versus just paper and in binders.
Yeah, I mean, every decision made within a CAPA investigation needs to have objective evidence. There needs to be a reason why you made the decisions that you made. So again, if that objective evidence can be managed and housed in a digital format, again, just makes it easier in presentation to an auditor, of why you made the decisions that you made. And again, paper is just a nightmare. If anybody's worked, in CAPA in particular, if anyone worked with a paper-based CAPA system, and I can tell you from experience, it's awful. So, any way that you can, make things electronic, and again, I go back to, there's a level of, or there's an aspect of electronic that also has to be considered, and that would be, validation and ensuring that the data that's being put in there is, appropriate and validated. But any chance to go digital and electronic, especially in CAPA, is the way to go.
So what can the hemp, CBD, and cannabis industry expect, kind of the next phase as it relates to CAPA and quality?
Well, CAPA is, part of any quality management system. Quality management systems, along with GMP, are kind of the quote-unquote buzzwords in the cannabis industry right now. And I say, like I said, quote-unquote buzzwords, but that's the shift that the industry is taking. Is quality is becoming much more important and looked at in this space. So you can't implement a quality management system without including a CAPA process. You can't implement a GMP program without including some sort of CAPA process. So, if you're going the route of quality, you have to incorporate CAPA somewhere in that organization. And like I said, the shift in this industry, just in the, I've been in it 4 years, which isn't a significant amount of time. I have seen such change and shift in the mentality with quality in general. Again, if you're going to implement an appropriate quality management system in your organization, CAPA has to be a component of that.
And you mentioned that there's a new policy coming out in the state of Colorado next year. Can you briefly touch upon that as well?
Yeah, so which we touched on in the beginning, I am part of the ASTM International D37 Cannabis Committee, and I've been part of that organization since the beginning of, since D37 was created. And I was the very first person to initiate a standard for that committee, and it happened to be on CAPA. But because CAPA is such a confusing topic, I was told actually in the very beginning, maybe you should wait 5 years to present this standard to the industry. And I'm like, I already knew from experience working, even today, CAPA is a hot button with pharmaceutical and med device companies. So I knew it was just a matter of time that it was going to be that way in cannabis. So it finally got approved just, I think, 6 months ago. Anyway, so the CAPA standard as well as the recall standard, the state of Colorado is adopting both of those ASTM standards because in 2021, every cannabis organization needs to have a CAPA plan. So that's pretty exciting. So I am the author of the CAPA standard for ASTM. And yeah, so I mean, that's Colorado, I feel, is probably, they're going to be the start of that, really
Right.
recognizing the importance of CAPA, but I just, I foresee that kind of translating into other markets as well.
So it's fair to say if somebody needs some help with this, you'd be the person to call for sure.
For
Talk
sure.
a little bit about the FDA's position on CAPA and how companies should be prepared for kind of some of the federal activity.
Yeah, I mean, of course, right now, on the marijuana side of things, things are not, cannabis is not regulated from the federal level. It's going to happen sooner than later, I think. But the FDA, I mean, per their QSIT, the Quality System Inspection Technique, they view CAPA as one of the most important elements of the quality management system. And based on everything that we talked about today, that CAPA subsystem is really the hub of where data is analyzed to determine what's going on in your organization, where are there issues, and what do we need to do to, to correct those issues. So this is a blurb from the QSIT manual.
Great, and we'll share this if you guys want to read this a little bit closer. So as far as, there's not a lot of specific regulations that relate to hemp or CBD or cannabis right now, but it doesn't mean that we can't find other regulations that are close or related. Talk a little bit about like what you recommend for hemp and CBD companies to follow, since we're still a little bit early at this stage.
Yeah, so this slide is really just to make the point that there's CAPA-related regulations everywhere, whether you're medical device, pharma, under ISO, ICH. But right now in the cannabis space, dietary supplement GMP and food GMPs are, kind of the routes people are taking. So within 21 CFR 117, which is the food regulation, subpart C deals with hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, and section 150 is corrective actions and corrections. So within the food space, the food GMPs, there's CAPA-related regulations, and then in the dietary supplement regulations, subparts E and F touch on CAPA-related activities. So, it's just deciding, the first thing, especially if you're going to implement GMP, is you need to kind of understand what flavor of GMP you're looking to implement into your organization. And then from there, it's just really finding what regulations are applicable to your organization. That doesn't mean that you can't look, if you're a food, if you want to follow GMP for food, it doesn't mean that you can't look at the medical device, 820.11 or .100 and implement those regulations as well, So you really kind of need to look across the board to see what's really applicable to your organization.
Awesome. And so when you first shared this as like medical devices, how does that have anything to do with hemp and CBD? And you brought up, I thought, because you've been doing this and have some good experience. Talk like briefly why that could apply to some companies.
Yeah, so within the ASTM Committee D37, there's multiple subcommittees, and one of the subcommittees that we just created was a device subcommittee to deal with, vapes and other sorts of devices that would be used in the cannabis space. Vape cartridges obviously are like the main ones. So those regulations definitely are relevant if you're an operation that is, manufacturing vapes for the industry.
There you go. So next thing, let's go to another poll. And the poll is, how confident are you in your company's current CAPA program? So let's push that out and get some results real quick. You should see something pop up in front of you. 5 is very confident, and 1 may be like, hey, we haven't even started yet. We're just thinking about it, or we're not confident at all. And if you have a client, just say kind of maybe on average where your clients are at if your company doesn't have it yet, and we'll get some responses back. They're coming in. We're averaging around 2.8 right now. And give it a couple more seconds, and we'll push this out. All right. Yeah, we ended up right around 2.8, so like a little below average, which is understandable. This is a new industry. We're getting there. So, all right, let's go to our next slide. So quick question, what does cost, right? And I guess cost can be evaluated in a lot of different ways, not just how much money do I need to spend to get the system set up, but also what could this cost you if you don't do this? Talk a little bit about that, Kathleen, and what companies should expect.
Yeah, so the cost of an effective or maybe ineffective CAPA program it can be pretty significant. So, and we tend to, talk in terms of reactive versus proactive. So reactive, and again, this isn't uncommon still, even in the pharma and med device spaces, is, you don't react to issues until they happen. So, failed inspections, if you don't have a proper procedure in place, product recalls, obviously are a huge cost to an organization. And unacceptable test results, if you don't have a solid process in place to you do proper test method validation, you have some serious issues. So those are all examples of like poor quality costs. Good quality, proactive costs would be, taking the time to invest in a proper incoming and receiving inspection program and process, so that way then you're evaluating your raw materials and components before you use them in manufacturing. Your internal auditing program is critical. An internal audit is your opportunity to find issues before, an FDA inspector finds it. I mean, it's much easier to fix things internally than to have an FDA inspector, find the issue and force you to maybe do things that you may not really have to do. And then, of course, keeping your equipment in good operating condition, ensuring that it's calibrated and cleaned appropriately. Those are all things that you can help or do to prevent significant downtime. You're always going to have issues. Like I said, you're never going to operate 100% all the time. But, it's really taking the time and establishing the quality processes up front. It's going to save you so much on the back end. And I have
Absolutely.
on here a CAPA investigation. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I have it on here. The CAPA investigation can total up to 15% of an organization's revenue. This is I pulled this stat a couple years ago from ASQ, and it's probably still pretty relevant. The example I gave with the varnish investigation, that cost our company close to $500,000.
Wow.
If you factor in the resources in which it took to investigate, I mean, it was months of investigating, and people, working on that investigation in addition to their, day job. So you have people working overtime, you have, and then of course the loss with product revenue. We had product out in the field that we had to bring back. So it can add up if you have an issue and you don't, and it's even more if you don't have a proper process in place to investigate efficiently.
Sure. No, absolutely. So when you look at potential problems that can go wrong, you mentioned recalls, fines from the state or federal government if the audits don't go the way they should and you can't correct it. Some businesses can get closed permanently or temporarily. Lawsuits, which are becoming an increased problem, and the civil lawsuits are a major issue because now you have people out in the market, aka attorneys, who are motivated financially to find a mislabeling problem, and then they're going to go to do the same test over and over and over again and get you that way. And of course, that results in brand damage, which is very hard to measure and repair. And everything related that deals with labor, hiring consultants, like pulling people off their primary job can be very stressful. So the whole point is like, how do we do things right up front in order to avoid problems down the road? And one of the way that we wanted to help companies to address some of these quality challenges is, how do you have a central system that has all what we call your master data? Your suppliers are put in there with clean data, your buyers, your ingredients, your recipes, tracking your transactions as they occur that are related to those clients, that provides an inventory management system, connecting your documents that you can say, hey, this transaction here connects to this supplier, connects to this certification, to make sure that all your ingredients are clean, when their expiration dates are. And ultimately, it creates what we call this visual map or end-to-end traceability, so that we want to give our clients the opportunity to have that seed to sale traceability that's just so important in kind of the hemp and CBD space, to help you guys sleep better and to minimize any of these potential issues. And when issues occur, just to be able to solve them that much faster. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about digital systems. When you see this visual map, how do you think that something like this can have an impact in this industry, Kathleen?
Well, again, in terms of CAPA, this is a dream because you're able to pull objective evidence fairly easily, as part of your investigation, instead of having to dig through, batch record documentation and supplier documentation. So again, it's nice to have it all housed in one area where you can pull, relevant data to your investigation. I mean, I can't stress enough how important it is just to have an electronic system. It just makes your life so much easier.
Absolutely. So let's kind of find out, we've heard a lot about today. Be curious, like, how high of a priority is CAPA for your company? And again, if you have clients, maybe you're in the insurance field or you're a consultant, just kind of answer for your clients, 5 stars is extremely high and 1 not at all. If you could let us know, would be great. So we get ratings coming in here. And it's looking pretty high so far. A lot of 5 stars. 1 4-star, a couple 2 stars, maybe people just figuring some things out. We'll give it 1 more second and we'll go from there. And while this is coming in, maybe share just some final thoughts, Kathleen, on where do people start, right? Like if you don't have a lot of experience, what should people be doing? The first thing they can do, whether it's like I need to call a consultant or I need to hire somebody, what would you recommend for somebody just who wants to get, implement this?
Honestly, 21 CFR 820.100 is a really good place to look for, kind of higher level guidance on CAPA. Those are medical device regulations, but and they're available online, of course. Of course, I'm going to give a little bit of a plug to ASTM, looking at the CAPA standard, which, when I wrote that standard, I pulled from a variety of regulations, some of which were on that one slide that we presented. So really get an understanding of what CAPA is, and there's a lot of resources out there. But then within your organization, you need to start with a procedure. And again, if you're a kind of a multi-function operation, even if you're a processor and you do, testing and process testing just to kind of determine potency, you still need to have validated methods, because you need to make sure that data that's coming out of that HPLC is actually valid. So in that situation, you may need to have an OOS. Well, you wouldn't necessarily, well, you should actually, because you need to know what's good, what's bad data. But within your organization, just establish those procedures and then, test them. You can do, for example, audits. You can do mock audits and mock recalls and really just challenge those procedures and see if, in the event you have an actual situation, is your process sufficient enough to address it and correct it?
Excellent. This was awesome. So if anybody, I don't think we see any questions here, which is the first time ever, which I'm just going to assume that means that you've covered every single topic and are so thorough, Kathleen, as usual. But if you want to get in touch with Kathleen, here's her contact information or email, Kathleen@Triskele-Inc.com. Phone number. Same with me. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about Tag One, about our systems, about our seed to sale traceability and food security and integrated supply chain platform, always happy to talk a little about where you're at, what you're doing, and maybe when the right time is. And maybe it's not now, but it could be in 6 months or next year, and just some things to consider. But we're here for you. We absolutely appreciate everybody joining us today. This will be recorded, and I'll be happy to share it with everybody that joined today. And of course, you can share it with others as well. So, Kathleen, thank you so much for your time today, and I appreciate everybody for taking time out of the schedule to join us.